Welcome to Story Proof. I'm Bradley.
And I'm Brendan.
And on this episode, we are going to be discussing the 2002 remake of the original Resident Evil. Now, we both have slightly different backgrounds and histories with this game franchise.
Do we ever?
Yeah, you got into them a little later because a good friend made you play them.
No, what happened was when we were in high school and then in college when we'd hang out, I would come over and you would make me play Resident Evil 5.
Okay.
On loop 3, 4, 5 times in a single day.
But it's so good.
It's fine. We'll get to it when we get to it. And we'll talk about that then. So what happened was I didn't get into really playing all of the Resident Evils until well after that fact. We'd played 5, we'd played 6. I hadn't really played any of the individual games prior to that myself until about 2020. It was right before COVID started. And
yeah, I feel like it was like I got you into them, and then I didn't hear you mention Resident Evil for a while, and then next thing I know, you got like the 2 remake, and you were trying to get S's on all of it, and then you got the 3 remake, and I was like, okay, hold up, he's getting better at this than I am.
Well, see, here's the thing. I was never really into them, no matter how many times we played 5 or we played 6.
Okay.
Whenever we played 5 and 6, I just went along with the story, and I thought it was all ludicrous. And I didn't understand what the hell was going on.
That's fair.
So then, come late 2019, early 2020, I had finished playing through some of the games that I had played through, the Assassin's Creed games, the Tomb Raider games from the 2010s, and I had gotten kind of bored with them, and I saw it being advertised that there was Resident Evil 3 remake coming out.
Oh, yeah.
And it was coming out in April of 2020. So I decided, okay, you know what? I've played 5 and 6 so many damn times already.
A few times.
I might as well figure out what the hell happened before all that, because maybe then I can connect some dots to what's happening in that. And
not many.
There are still some dots to be had, but there's a lot of ground that had to be covered between where Resident Evil 1 picks up and where Resident Evil 5 and 6 pick up, especially the jump from 5 to 6.
I mean, yeah, that's fair.
So I decided, well, if I'm going to play RE3 remake when it comes out, I might as well try to play through 1 and play through 2 beforehand. I knew 2 had just come out the previous year, and
the remake.
The remake, yes. I believe they might have had RE1 on sale at that point too. So it was just one of those things where I just decided, hey, I'm going to go ahead and do this. And so I went and bought it, and I played through 1. And I knew it was different. You have fixed camera angles and stuff like that. But
Tank controls.
But I wasn't prepared for how it was a bit of a learning curve to go back to playing something that's like that. Dude,
I remember us playing 5, and all you would do is bitch and complain about the fact that you couldn't move and shoot at the same time, and I was always just normal. I'm like, this is it. This is what Resident Evil is.
And it's ridiculous. I'm coming from the position of when I'm playing a shooter game like Halo or Call of Duty or something like that, you're able to move and run and shoot all at the same time. It's really not that complicated.
Yeah, but it's not Resident Evil. I want my laser sights, and I want to stand still.
Okay, so you're saying that the newer games are inferior?
Possibly. I mean, I like 5, clearly. I like 5. I have recruited so many people to play 5 with me. I can't stop. There have been so many times that Chris and I have literally finished that game, just deleted our saves, and then just started over. He never wanted to delete saves. He always liked having infinite ammo, and I think it's fun. But I always like the working up to, upgrade your weapons, and almost like the RPG-esque aspect to it. Speaking of Chris, though, he's the one that got me into Resident Evil back on the N64. Because we used to swap N64 games fairly often. I'm not going to lie, I think I still have his Star Fox 64.
There's a very good chance of that.
I'm pretty sure the version I own is just his. So, Chris, if you're hearing this, my bad. I've had it for roughly 15 years now. And he had one that was scratched all to shit. I mean, the case looked awful, and you couldn't even tell what game it was anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So he let me borrow it, and I started playing it. It was the original Resident Evil 2. And I got hooked. I love puzzle games. I feel like that's something that we really grew up with. A lot of the Zelda games are very puzzle-based. A lot of puzzle platformers as well. I just really liked playing Resident Evil. I played 2 a lot. And I didn't really hear much about 3. And then 4 came out. And then from there on out, it's been just everything. 5, I really do love the co-op-ness of it. Resident Evil 6, I enjoy. I feel like we have played that one a lot. That's all. It was always clear to me that you liked that one more than 5. I guess probably moving and shooting at the same time probably had something to do with that. And then when 7 came out, because it was first person, I will admit I was one of the people that was a bit turned off by that, just because it was so different. Didn't necessarily think it looked bad. I know a lot of people called that a big return to form for the Resident Evil series, which is fair. I get that. And then Village. I think you were the one that talked me into getting Village. That you just really liked it. I knew that Chris showed up at the end of 7. So I was like, oh, okay, there's a good tie-in to everything. The Resident Evil verse. And then I played Village and loved it. I've also played Umbrella Chronicles. I love Operation Raccoon City. That's one of my favorites. One of my next 2 tattoos is going to be the umbrella symbol on my arm with "Our business is life itself." My car that I drive actually looks like a company car because it's got the umbrella logo on the side. But yeah, I get asked all the time, like, do you sell umbrellas? I had a few people like, do you sell insurance? No. I do love it though when people recognize it. I've had so many people at like red lights and drive-throughs and just driving down the street. A lot of people really see it and acknowledge it, appreciate it, think it's really cool. But yeah, I've been into Resident Evil for so long. You came around eventually. It took a little while.
I think a lot of my resistance was just the ridiculousn's of the plot of 5 and 6 sometimes, especially 6.
I like how you make it sound like that's my fault.
It is your fault.
Yeah, I said I like how you make it sound like that. I love 5, I can't help it.
But no, it did come around because, like you said, I also enjoy puzzles. I've always enjoyed puzzles. I do jigsaws in my spare time and stuff like that. I like puzzle games. So when Resident Evil came around, I didn't necessarily know the original was really puzzle based, because 5, 6, that whole little trilogy generation, they're puzzles, but they're not really puzzles. It's just sort of, hey, move this thing, hey, shoot this thing.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
the laser room. I was like, wait, are there any puzzles in? Oh yeah.
That's basically the only one that's there in 5. 6 doesn't really have any. 4 has a few, but it's like, move this sword from here to there, and move that sword from there to here.
Yeah, that's fair.
Resident Evil 1, especially, it's just all puzzles.
Yeah.
Like, the entire mansion is a puzzle. So I really connected with it on that, and then there's a really awesome little story that we're going to talk about here today that I think really permeates through, especially the remake. And again, I don't have a whole lot of experience pre-2019 with everything. Most of my fandom comes with the original 3 being remade. The 1 remake, 2 remake, and 3 remake. And then moving on there, I've played the original 4. Obviously, we're looking forward to the 4 remake that's coming out in March. And then on down, I've played all of the major storyline stuff, including Code Veronica. I haven't played like Umbrella Chronicles or anything like that, the little spin-offs.
You're not missing much in Umbrella Chronicles. Operation Raccoon City is one of my favorites, because I like how they fit it in with the gameplay being very different and it's fun. Umbrella Chronicles is the one that released, I think, for the Wii, and it feels very much like a House of the Dead type arcade shooter. But story-wise, it's just not. It's not really that important. I think it is easily the worst regarded Resident Evil game out there. I like when you mentioned how puzzle-based it is because, 4, I think, really started the action survival part of it, and then once
Yeah.
you get to 5, it's just an action game at that point. Same thing for 6. They never really feel much like survival games. But this one, your ammo is very limited. You're not walking around with, 9 inventory slots all filled with weapons. It is very puzzle-based. It is very inventory management heavy. It is very challenging. To be honest, these first couple, dude, they can be pretty ball-bustingly difficult at times.
Oh yeah, they are the true definition of survival horror, which is why they pretty much coined the phrase survival horror.
Yeah.
That whole genre of just scarce resources. There's so many things that this game was influential for.
Yeah, I will say that going back and playing this, I think the thing that is the most... I don't really know if it's off-putting now, because I grew up playing Doom as well, like the original Doom. And those games have a kind of similar thing where the game actually does a fair bit of the aiming for you. You don't have a reticle, you don't have the laser sight as much. It's really just you kind of get in the right direction and pull the trigger until the megapixels stop moving. That being said, with the 2002 remake, they're very pretty megapixels. But that is very off-putting to me now, because now we're in the day and age of very accurate shooting and games and aim assist and things like that. But yeah, going back to those older games, I think that and the tank controls are probably the things that to me date this game the most. Even more than the graphics, even more than some of the voice acting and stuff like that, I really do think.
Yeah, I'd agree that those are definitely the oldest aspects of the game in and of itself, are the tank controls and the sort of auto-aiming, at least, not really auto-aiming, but you have 3 different options. You shoot low, you shoot middle, or you shoot high. And it's just sort of going at that thing. Although, if you do squeeze the aim trigger, it will generally point you towards the target, so...
You know what, now that we're talking about these, you know what I've never thought was weird before until literally 8 seconds ago? The herb system. They're just like, oh no, you're injured. Do drugs. Yay. Oh, you have this random grassy herb? Oh, it's a spray now? That's amazing.
Well, in a way, it kind of makes sense. Humanity's used herbs for thousands of years as poultices and
Yeah, but what the
healing
hell
items
herb
and
out
stuff
there
like
if you
that.
like...
It's a very specific and special herb that's only indigenous to the Arklay Mountains. That is canon. Look it up.
I know, but it's still just... I've never thought it was weird until right now, and I'm like, oh. And then at 4, when you start mixing yellow herbs, it's like, oh, it makes your health bar bigger. Does Leon just permanently get stronger? Because those are steroids. So, diving into the actual story of Resident Evil, what it starts with is you've got Alpha Squad of the STARS Special Unit of Raccoon City, and they are actually going into the Arklay Mountains because their Bravo Squad has gone missing. But once they get there, their helicopter mysteriously gets sabotaged and crashes.
Very mysterious. What could possibly have gone on?
And then they are beset upon by zombie dogs.
Zombie dogs.
Yeah. Something I've always found very interesting in this particular part of the game, but in a zombie series, zombie franchise of zombie games starring zombies, I've always found it interesting that the first thing that attacks you is not a regular zombie.
Are you absolutely certain there are zombies in
I'm
this game?
fairly positive that there are zombies in this game. But yeah, I've always found it interesting that it's zombie dogs. That's something that's become so iconic with Resident Evil. I personally cannot think, first off, of many other things where the idea of a zombified animal is used. They exist. I've seen other ones. But to the best of my knowledge, especially for me, Resident Evil is the first one I knew of that had like a zombified animal.
Yeah,
like
that's really the most interesting way to open this, is to take something that people really haven't seen before and just throw it straight at you. And even right off the bat, you can't necessarily tell that the dogs are zombified, though. You just think, okay, these are some weird-ass freaking dogs attacking everybody.
Yeah. From there, you kind of end up, your squad goes towards this very nice mansion up in the mountains.
Not at all conspicuous.
This is the Spencer Mansion, which is where, spoiler alert, most of the game is going to take place. So you've got Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine. They are the 2 playable characters in this game. They are very much important to the story, to the plot, to the entire series. They are going to come up again in other games.
One more so than the other.
That's fair. You've also got Barry Burton and Rebecca Chambers that are moderately important. Rebecca Chambers, particularly in Resident Evil 0, not in this one as much. And then you've got Brad Vickers, who also is in this, maybe not as much. And then you've got Albert Wesker, who is the glorious sunglass-wearing badass, whom I thoroughly enjoy in everything.
Yeah, if you can't tell, Bradley's kind of obsessed with the villainous characters.
He's every bit as extra as I am, and I love it. Once you get into the mansion is where the real, gameplay part takes over.
Yeah, at that point you're going to sit here and you're going to have already chosen whether you're playing as Jill or Chris. As soon as you go through the doors into the mansion, you get into the main hall, and all of a sudden, depending on which character you choose, either Chris or Jill, the other is mysteriously missing. And nobody knows what's going on, one way or the other. Certain characters are split into each main character's storyline. So Jill and Barry are intrinsically linked with one another. Chris and Rebecca become intrinsically linked with one another. Wesker is kind of involved in both, but more so in Chris's campaign than in Jill's campaign. Jill is mostly just involved with Barry when it comes down to it. Rebecca shows up midway through to help with Chris's story, and Wesker is kind of the Barry role in Chris's campaign.
And I do want to take just a second, even though we are talking predominantly about the 2002 remake of the original Resident Evil, I do want to take a second to mention the idea of having two playable characters with two pretty similar stories but a bit different, and the idea that there is a male character to choose from and a female character to choose from. Because that is something you're going to see a lot in Resident Evil. You're going to see it again in 2. You're going to see it again in 5. You're going to see it in pretty much every campaign option except for one of them in Resident Evil 6.
One thing that I found interesting about this game originally, they were planning on making this co-op originally.
Interesting.
So you would have been able to play with a friend as one as Jill, one as Chris, and go through the mansion together. I don't know how that would have worked with the way that the story is built out.
Yeah.
But that was something that they were considering, definitely with the remake, maybe with the original in '96 as well.
It is very interesting you mentioned that, because I actually did not know that, but one of the DLCs in Resident Evil 5, you play as Chris and Jill, and you go back through the Spencer Mansion.
Yeah, the Nightmares one, right?
Yeah.
Lost in Nightmares or something like that.
So that's interesting. So when you're in the mansion, one particular thing I have always really appreciated about this game, and I think they did it just incredibly well, is that this is not the most linear of games. It doesn't really have levels. It's not like do this level, do this thing, do this level, do this thing. But the way that the game is built around the puzzles and around certain keys and having certain items to access things, it really makes it where there is a maze inside of the house that you can access at different points in the story, where it really is just all kind of taking place in this mansion, and it never, to me, feels like a small location. It always feels like there's just so much there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that format lends itself to so many of the mysteries and the sort of and the way that the plot develops out in and among itself in this game. Because, you think even about the very beginning of the game, once you get into the mansion, where Wesker will send you, either as Jill or Chris, off to investigate. You go into the dining room, and then you proceed further into the first main hallway, and you get to that first iconic shot of Resident Evil.
It's so good!
Where you come across the zombie feeding on your fallen comrade Kenneth. Everybody who's played Resident Evil knows that shot of the zombie just slowly turning its head towards you.
Yeah, that really is one of the shots, man. When I think about Resident Evil, I think that is the most iconic shot in the entire franchise. Pretty easily, actually. Yeah. I know plenty of people who don't know Resident Evil at all, and they know that shot.
Yeah, it's one that they've tried to recreate multiple times in the various movies and other media, even I believe in other games, they've tried to get something that's similar to in feel to it, and there's just nothing that quite hits the same way that you see that first one. Especially, I'm sure, when the original game first came out, and people were just like, "Okay, I'm here sitting here with Resident Evil, but I don't know anything about it," and all of a sudden you get that zombie turning at you.
God, that is cool to think of, though, of playing these without really knowing what the whole series is about. That's cool.
That's
Because we are of the age where, frankly, the first one,
yeah,
we were a little young to have played the first one when it came out.
yeah. We definitely would not have been able to play the original on its original release.
No.
For sure.
I was 4.
Definitely would have been able to play the remake when it came out if you had access to the GameCube.
Yeah.
But
yeah, then you are officially in the mansion. You are looking for your team, your teammates. We talked a little bit earlier about the tank controls and the aiming. There is a big ammo conservation thing in this game. This is not a true action based game. It is very much survival. You really have to be like, do I need to hold on to this ammo, or do I need to take this item that I think is going to be able to help me do this thing? I joked about earlier with the herbs. That is something that stays pretty consistent in the games. I know the last two have changed it up a little bit with the medicine, but Resident Evil is always really stuck by the green herb, the red herb, mixing them together, sometimes yellow herbs in some of the games, the first aid spray, things like that. That is how you replenish your health. One thing, especially with the item management in this game, is that your inventory is oh so limited. Oh my god.
that's for sure. It's a little different based on which character that you're playing as well, because Jill has 2 extra item slots, I believe, over Chris. Chris is technically the quote-unquote hard mode, because he gets less item slots. He doesn't have the lockpick, so he has to go around finding these little keys to open up certain doors to be able to get to certain items and everything else. And meanwhile, Jill, the master of unlocking, but Jill is very adept with the lockpick, so
Yeah.
she gets one early on from Barry in her campaign, which helps to conserve that, but she also gets 2 extra item slots to start off with that she can carry extra equipment with.
To be honest, most of the story of this is to be honest, fairly basic. This is really setting up a lot of stuff. The zombie virus in this game is called the progenitor virus. It is the great-granddaddy of all of the viruses to come. And there is a certain character. Her name is Lisa Trevor. And, she turns out to be one of the most important characters in the history of Resident Evil, despite, in what you see of her, really not doing a whole lot.
It's not really so much in what she does inside of the story as much as in what the files and the backstory around her come into. This is really the biggest selling point for most people when it comes to Resident Evil Remake, is the fact that they took the main original game, they put new graphics, new advanced material and everything else on it, and then they added this extra bit of context, because in the original you had this mention of George Trevor, who helped build the traps at the mansion with his family. You had a mention of them as well, but you don't really know exactly what happened to them. You just know that George Trevor died because you come across his grave. In the remake, they add this entire new storyline that is just upping the tragedy by 1,000.
Yeah, even in the overall realm world of Resident Evil, I'm not gonna lie, this one sucks, dude.
Oh yeah, this is probably the saddest and most tragic character in the entire franchise. She's just this little kid who gets just taken as a hostage to keep her father working and keeping secrets about the mansion and all the puzzles and twists and turns and secret passageways and whatnot. And then she's used just as this horrible guinea pig for all the different viruses.
So yeah, she and her mother were taken hostage to try to keep her father in check. Eventually, Spencer is just like, I don't trust this guy at all, so Spencer kills the father. Then they start experimenting with the progenitor virus on the mother and daughter. The daughter takes to it extraordinarily well. She bonds with it very well. The mother does not, and as they continue their tests, eventually the mother, they decide, just isn't worth it, so spoiler alert, they kill the mom. I like how I keep saying spoiler alert before saying very sad stuff. Anyway, so the daughter, Lisa, they just keep experimenting on her. Eventually, they inject her with the parasite from Nemesis, and she bonds with it and is able to use some of the Nemesis-like powers. She ends up developing a bit of an eyeball-like tumor, which, if anyone knows Resident Evil, knows is very reminiscent of the G virus. They are actually able to use her to eventually develop the G virus. So she is just absolutely monumental in the story of Resident Evil, even though her story isn't quite done. Eventually, they decide that she's just not worth it anymore now that they've either developed or are successfully developing the G virus. So they go to, quote-unquote, kill her. The problem with that is they have made her way too difficult to kill, because she has all of these viruses just coursing through her veins. So she ends up really just sort of rummaging around the mansion for a couple of years. You bump into her at a few different times throughout the game, and then there is a section towards the end where she's very animalistic at this point. She's not really savable as far as, even if we get her out of here, she's not, going to become one with society at this point. She's lived like an animal for years. I think mother is like the only word she's capable of saying.
Yeah, if she's able to say anything at all, that's basically her sole obsession is finding her mother. Because he gets less item slots, he doesn't have the lockpick, so he has to go around finding these little keys to open up certain doors to be able to get to certain items and everything else. And meanwhile, Jill, the master of unlocking, but Jill is very adept with the lockpick, so
yeah,
she gets one early on from Barry in her campaign, which helps to conserve that, but she also gets 2 extra item slots to start off with that she can carry extra equipment with.
To be honest, most of the story of this is to be honest, fairly basic. This is really setting up a lot of stuff. The zombie virus in this game is called the progenitor virus. It is the great-granddaddy of all of the viruses to come. And there is a certain character. Her name is Lisa Trevor. And, she turns out to be one of the most important characters in the history of Resident Evil, despite, in what you see of her, really not doing a whole lot.
It's not really so much in what she does inside of the story as much as in what the files and the backstory around her come into. This is really the biggest selling point for most people when it comes to Resident Evil Remake, is the fact that they took the main original game, they put new graphics, new advanced material and everything else on it, and then they added this extra bit of context, because in the original you had this mention of George Trevor, who helped build the traps at the mansion with his family. You had a mention of them as well, but you don't really know exactly what happened to them. You just know that George Trevor died because you come across his grave. In the remake, they add this entire new storyline that is just upping the tragedy by 1,000.
Yeah, even in the overall realm world of Resident Evil, I'm not gonna lie, this one sucks, dude.
Oh yeah, this is probably the saddest and most tragic character in the entire franchise. She's just this little kid who gets just taken as a hostage to keep her father working and keeping secrets about the mansion and all the puzzles and twists and turns and secret passageways and whatnot. And then she's used just as this horrible guinea pig for all the different viruses.
So yeah, she and her mother were taken hostage to try to keep her father in check. Eventually, Spencer is just like, I don't trust this guy at all, so Spencer kills the father. Then they start experimenting with the progenitor virus on the mother and daughter. The daughter takes to it extraordinarily well. She bonds with it very well. The mother does not, and as they continue their tests, eventually the mother, they decide, just isn't worth it, so spoiler alert, they kill the mom. I like how I keep saying spoiler alert before saying very sad stuff. Anyway, so the daughter, Lisa, they just keep experimenting on her. Eventually, they inject her with the parasite from Nemesis, and she bonds with it and is able to use some of the Nemesis-like powers. She ends up developing a bit of an eyeball-like tumor, which, if anyone knows Resident Evil, knows is very reminiscent of the G virus. They are actually able to use her to eventually develop the G virus. So she is just absolutely monumental in the story of Resident Evil, even though her story isn't quite done. Eventually, they decide that she's just not worth it anymore now that they've either developed or are successfully developing the G virus. So they go to, quote-unquote, kill her. The problem with that is they have made her way too difficult to kill, because she has all of these viruses just coursing through her veins. So she ends up really just sort of rummaging around the mansion for a couple of years. You bump into her at a few different times throughout the game, and then there is a section towards the end where she's very animalistic at this point. She's not really savable as far as, even if we get her out of here, she's not, going to become one with society at this point. She's lived like an animal for years. I think mother is like the only word she's capable of saying.
Yeah, if she's able to say anything at all, that's basically her sole obsession is finding her mother.
Yeah. And later on she does, and this is where my joke comes in, because as difficult as she is to kill, she finds her mother's tomb, grabs her mother's skull, and then yeets herself into just this unholy pit of nothing. And that's the end of her story. She just had a cocktail of all of these cool viruses, and that's how they're just like, you know what? We don't know how to kill her. How about she just literally yeets herself out of the story?
She doesn't just yeet herself.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Throughout the whole story, she is working on finding herself around the mansion, trying to reunite with her mother. That is her sole obsession and focus throughout her entire story at this point. As you said, you run into her multiple times. Eventually, everything comes to a head when you're making your way towards the final section of the game, when you go to the underground lab.
Mm-hmm.
And you come across this suspended tomb area where her mother is entombed.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on which character you're playing, as either Jill or Chris, you have to save yourself and either Barry or Wesker from being killed. The ultimate tragedy is that she finds her mother and then she jumps because there's nothing else for her.
Uh-huh. And what does she jump into?
She jumps down into the cavern below.
So she grabs her mother's skull and yeets herself into oblivion. One for Bradley.
No, I feel like you're making too much of a light of the tragedy in this.
I am, because it's sad. I don't want to talk about it. Shit's sad. But, like I said, the fact that literally G comes from her, she was used as a test subject for the Nemesis parasite. So, really so much of what Umbrella does comes from her. Which, to me, is why it's so shocking that she would not be a more prominent figure in the original game. Because the original game does a lot of world building in really good ways. But Resident Evil 2, I think, is really the one that kind of uses that to just blow up in popularity in particular.
Well, absolutely, but I think part of it is also just to do with the hindsight of everything. We're seeing it even now with the RE2 and RE3 remakes going into RE4. There's a very specific file in RE3 that directly links Resident Evil 3 to the Plagas in Resident Evil 4 Remake.
Yeah.
But I think having the hindsight of having already put out what was 2, what was 3, and knowing where they were going with 4 at that point when they made this remake, they were able to go back and develop that story with Lisa more to intertwine it with the G virus, the T virus, the parasite.
Yeah.
So that is why it's there and wouldn't have been as fleshed out in the original as it is in the remake when they wrote that story to add on to the overall story. So doubling back now, we make our way through the mansion, opening the various doors, finding our various aspects, and we come to find out that this mansion is owned by this man called Spencer, and that this mansion is basically just a headquarters for a pharmaceutical conglomerate known as Umbrella. We touched on it a little bit in the introduction, but Umbrella is, yes, a pharmaceutical company, but it is also really just a front for a company that is making biological weapons on the side. This whole mansion is built on top of a massive lab where they've been doing all these experiments on Lisa Trevor, on just whatever victims they could have. And we come to find out that all of the entire experience, all the people who are infected are basically just here because they were being used as test subjects themselves. Every creature you've come into contact with is just a part of a larger plot.
Oh my god, though, Brendan. How on earth did Umbrella ever get the STARS people there?
Let me tell you, I think that STARS has an inside man. And who could that inside man be?
The MVP himself, Albert Wesker!
So basically it turns out that Albert Wesker is a double agent. He started off in Umbrella as a scientist / high-ranking official, and he also decided to become a cop.
Yay.
In the meantime, to help maintain his cover.
That's normal.
So he forms this special unit, STARS, with the RPD in Raccoon City. Partners with the captain of B Squad, Enrico Marini, and they just find all these people who were in special forces or showed extra ability and recruited them, and that's why we're here. Wesker conspired with several other of his associates to draw STARS in to test the lethality of the creatures that were being developed by the virus. Basically, his idea was if the specially trained people in STARS could be defeated by the zombies and really his magnum opus, the Tyrant, then the virus is ready for mass production and they could sell bioweapons to the world.
It doesn't work out so well for him in this.
Well, I mean, I guess it all depends on whether you're looking at hindsight or not.
Okay, that's fair.
I mean, between his appearances in Code Veronica and 5...
It kind of works for him.
I mean, I do think that he was overselling the Tyrant's ability just a smidge.
Yeah. It's not that hard to kill.
This ultimate creature, as he builds it, is taken out by 5 good shots from a Magnum and a rocket launcher.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, he can swat the rocket launcher away if he's looking directly at you.
Yeah, that crap's annoying.
But if you make contact, that's it.
Yeah, you're done. That is the story of most of Resident Evil. Bring a rocket launcher. So many bosses in Resident Evil 4, I'm just like, boss soup, done.
Which is something I kind of appreciate about the more recent games, like 7 and Village. They don't really end with giant rocket launchers.
I don't know, man. In Village, once you play as Chris, you can, like, use a laser to summon hits from some type of orbital
Yeah,
platform.
but he's a special agent. You can kind of, like...
Yeah, what the hell kind of special agent has access to that? Pull up my laser light. Bleep. Oh, look. Oh, it's dead.
You know what, Bradley? This is Resident Evil. At some point, you have to suspend some disbelief somewhere. And I think that point is in Resident Evil 5, when Wesker just becomes Ouroboros.
Yeah. I do want to take a second to say something interesting about the zombies. So, it is a very popular thing with zombies and zombies in pop culture that everyone thinks about brains. To the best of my knowledge, the version I know of is Return of the Living Dead, which I think came out in like 88? 88, 85?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
85, not 88. That is the first time, I believe, that like a pop culture type thing mentions brains and zombies eating brains. These zombies are not that. They do go after people, they do eat them, but it's not necessarily a brains thing.
Well, the most interesting thing about these zombies is that they aren't even undead.
Yeah.
In the story, they are technically still alive.
I mean, not when I'm done with them, but sure.
The virus just degrades them in such a way that they can't think, they can't act, and they start to look rotted, but they are still very much living, because a virus has to have a living host in order to make it happen. And that's what this is. It's a virus that's causing all of this.
Yeah, and there are two things I think are very important. One of them, I will admit, comes into play later, particularly in the movies. That's always bothered me with the zombies, is they talk about how they are moved by their most basic instinct, to eat. That's fair. That's pretty much universal across the board with zombies.
Sure.
But it always annoys me in zombie movies and TV shows and things, if a zombie is sitting there eating someone, why would they get up and attack someone else? Their most basic instinct is to feed. They are literally feeding. Why would they go after someone else? There's a particular scene, I believe in the third Anderson Resident Evil movie, where two people get locked in a room with one zombie, and the zombie chomps on one and then immediately goes for the other. And that's always bothered me. Because they literally say his most basic instinct is to feed. Not hunt, to feed. You had food. Anyway, the other thing that's always bothered me in zombie video games in particular is the idea that this virus is spread via a bite. If you get bitten, you're infected. Sometimes a scratch. I know The Walking Dead is probably the biggest one I know of with scratches.
Right.
But if that's the case, why don't your characters ever get infected? They get bitten a lot. I am not great at the first Resident Evil.
That's fair. I could be wrong about this. I'll have to look it up. But I believe that the in-canon explanation is that they either have some resistance somehow, or they just were lucky enough not to get infected. Canonically, I think we can assume that in spite of the player's individual ability to avoid being bitten, that in the story itself, they were never actually bitten.
Yeah, that's fair.
Now, the concern becomes, and I think, again, they note this in files in Resident Evil 3, I believe, at the beginning with Jill. They do question whether there's some airborne potentiality to the virus.
Yeah.
Where that could be something, so they're constantly monitoring themselves, because those first 3 games take place in the span of about 3 months of each other.
Yeah.
I think ultimately the idea is, in the overall canon of the story, they managed to get out of this whole situation unbitten and unhurt.
Yeah.
For the most part. But
no, this has always bothered me. I honestly, of all the zombie games out there, I only personally know of 2 that have in-story reasons for it, and both of them involve you already being infected.
That's fair criticism. But again, I think we can make the assumption that in Resident Evil, you just canonically do not actually get bitten, and that's why you're able to go on.
Yeah, that's fair.
Alright, so Resident Evil. Pretty good game.
Yeah, it's a pretty good game.
It's really impressive how much it holds up over the last 21 years now that it's been out. I think it literally just passed its 21-year anniversary, or it's coming up here in the next couple months.
Yeah. I've heard them possibly rumored about remaking this one again.
Yeah, there's been some talk about doing a more modern take with the third-person shooter over the shoulder, the way they've done RE2, RE3, RE4 coming up.
Yeah.
And I mean, to an extent, I would like to see these settings in the modern engine. Just think about rendering the Spencer Mansion in the modern engine. But at the same time, with this game holding up so well, you don't really need it.
Yeah, but at the same point in time, I think they've done such a great, if not phenomenal job with 2. I still think with 3, I'm very excited to see what they're doing with 4. I honestly think that they have enough goodwill built up that they could do it. I know you personally like the first Resident Evil a little bit more than me. I will admit that even with the remake, I still find the tank controls to be a little extra clunky. I feel like it's impossible to not have a dated game feel just in the gameplay as long as you use that.
That's totally fair, and I agree. I'm not the biggest fan of the tank controls either, especially having only come to the series and having played that game within the last 3 years.
Yeah.
Especially, I've never played anything with tank controls prior to that point that I can remember.
That's fair.
So it's a huge learning curve even now going back to that game after I've played Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil 2, even Resident Evil 4 for what it has with its dynamics of having to stop and stand and shoot in place and whatnot else. It's a totally different style of play. But again, just with the overall story, with the gameplay itself outside of the tank controls, the fixed camera angles, the classic door transitions, everything else, it has its charms, even with the clunkiness that I love. But then we can remember, even if they do remake it, you still have the original there that you can play. It's not like they're going to take it out of circulation or something.
Hopefully. It'd be a real shame if they did. Yeah, I will say that a lot of the uniqueness of the game and a lot of the, honestly, it sounds a little cheesy, but the heart of the game is still there. And yeah, we talked a lot about the story and a lot about the characters. We touched a little bit about the impact of this game, but I don't think we could ever understate the actual cultural impact that this game
absolutely
has had.
Absolutely not. This thing is just a monster when it comes to the overall landscape, not just of horror video games, but horror in general and the zombie genre.
Yeah.
Especially.
I mean, we know George Romero to pretty much be like the king of zombies. Mm-hmm. And he stated in, I believe, a few different interviews that he really credits the Resident Evil video game, the first one in particular, with a big resurgence in just this love of zombies. And right around the time that this remake hit is when you just start getting a ton of movies. You get 28 Days Later, 28 Weeks Later, you do get Zombieland, World War Z, a little ways down the road, The Walking Dead, which, I mean, is, you want to talk about zombies in popular culture. Greg Nicotero, very popular in The Walking Dead, has talked plenty of times in interviews about his love of the Resident Evil series in general. Dude, this thing's just a juggernaut, man. It is, I mean, we mentioned a little bit earlier about the idea of survival horror games. Really, I mean, the phrase literally came about because of this game. I mean, you just can't understate that enough. And the fact that it is still as playable now as it is, the fact that it holds up as well as it is, it's respected as it is. I mean, it's just an absolute titan. There are so many lists about, like, top 100 most important games of all time, top 100 greatest games of all time. Dude, Resident Evil's on these lists all over the place.
Oh, yeah. Exactly. You really sit here and you think about it. Outside of, Romero's films throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, when he's making, Day, Dawn, stuff like that, that's kind of dragging the horror genre through, but, I mean, the zombie genre through. But you're not really seeing zombies as this mainstream sort of juggernaut of horror culture until you get the resurgence from Resident Evil. Absolutely.
Yeah.
1996 kicks off that, and then you get Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 right as the turn of the millennium comes. You get this remake, and as you said, that's when we start to see
just a tidal wave.
all these waves of movies just coming out, and it's still carrying over now 20 years later from that. We're still getting... They just ended The Walking Dead, last year?
Yeah, not too long ago.
So...
And, a lot of people in particular have talked about how the zombie craze is dying. I mean, it may have lessened a bit, but, dude, I feel like it's almost every bit as strong as it ever has been. I mean, we've still got a bunch of zombie video games coming down the pipe. We've still got some pretty big zombie-based releases within the last year or so. I also want to take a minute to talk about how you mentioned George Romero and you mentioned some of his movies, and you don't mention Night of the Living Dead. I find that very strange.
Well, look, Night is obviously the pinnacle, okay? But
Whoa. The pinnacle? Look, Dawn of the Dead exists for a reason, okay? That'll be another video.
But here's where I'm coming from. As great as Night is, they're not necessarily zombies in the way that we think of zombies.
That is fair.
The way that Dawn and Day and Resident Evil and everything that's come afterwards are. They're just reanimated bodies. They're not really...
I get what you're saying.
You see what I'm saying?
I was going to give you crap because that wasn't the one you mentioned. I thought that was funny.
But that's the only reason I didn't mention it, is because I don't think of it as the... Yes, it's created the zombie subgenre, and it's an impeccable work that has so much meaning to the horror genre as a whole. And we wouldn't have Resident Evil without that, more than likely. But
I will say, now that we've kind of gone off on this little bit of tangent, it makes me think I have actively heard people refer to Night of the Living Dead as that old zombie movie. I don't think I've ever heard anyone refer to Resident Evil as that old zombie game. People who like zombie games have just played Resident Evil and they love it.
Yeah.
I genuinely don't think... I know I was giving you crap for it earlier. You were the only person I've ever met that, at least for a while, did not like Resident Evil. And that's just because I heard you complain so much about having to stand still to shoot. But it's just one of those things that, like, everyone that plays it loves it. And I talked earlier about my car having this logo on the sides of it. It just kills me sometimes when I see people. I've had everyone from 16-year-olds to dudes in their 50s. I had one guy be like, I bet you wouldn't expect it from me. And in my mind, I'm like, well, you would have been the perfect video game playing age when the first one came out, so you're right.
That's fair. Yeah, Resident Evil is a cultural juggernaut in and of itself. And it's amazing to think that they've been doing this for going on 25 years now. Over 25 years now. And they're still going strong. They've had their lulls and they've had their dips and dives, and we'll surely get into them as we move on into other games and other movies and the TV shows and stuff like that, because Lord knows we have our complaints about a lot of them. But ultimately, this franchise and this property of Resident Evil is iconic and will continue to be iconic, even as they continue to evolve away necessarily from the zombie way of it to where they are now with the true biohazards of it. And further on to whatever the next stage is whenever they get through this current trilogy with 9. So it'll be interesting to see where they continue to develop. And maybe we'll get a decent adaptation of the first 3 games in a TV show one day. Who knows?
I feel like you're hoping for a lot there, but I get
that. Yeah. And that was Resident Evil Remake from 2002.
If you enjoyed that, we hope that you join us as we continue our deep dive into movies, TV shows, video games, and more. I'm Bradley.
And I'm Brendan.
And this has been Story Proof.